He stared at the document like it was a verdict. Not a legal one, a moral one. They call it failure, divorce. A word heavy enough to collapse a man's spine before he even understands what happened. From the moment the ink dries, the story is already written for him. He didn't try hard enough. He wasn't emotionally available. He missed the signs. He failed. But words are not neutral. They are tools. And failure is one of the most efficient psychological weapons we've ever normalized. Because when you frame an outcome as failure, you stop asking structural questions. You stop asking why the system produced this result. You personalize it, internalize it, carry it alone. That framing didn't appear by accident. It was planted. Modern culture quietly sold men a performance-based fantasy. Marriage equals success. Longevity equals virtue. Divorce equals personal deficiency. It turns an institution into a scoreboard and turns a man into a contestant. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Institutions don't measure morality. They manage incentives. And incentives shape behavior far more reliably than love ever could. If divorce were truly a failure, it would be treated like one. Socially discouraged, structurally painful, morally complex. Instead, it's framed as liberation, as self-actualization, as finding yourself. Notice the asymmetry. One side is told to reflect and rebuild. The other is told to heal and move on. That doesn't make anyone evil, but it does reveal something important about the system itself. Picture this: a man sitting alone at a kitchen table he once helped furnish. The house is quiet in a way that feels artificial, too clean, too final. He's replaying conversations, not the fights, the silences, the subtle shifts, the moments he dismissed because every relationship goes through phases. He asks himself the question every man asks eventually: how did this happen without me noticing? What he doesn't realize yet is this: by the time divorce becomes a conversation, it has already stopped being a question. For one side, it became an option long before it became an announcement. We like to believe divorce is a tragic collision, two people drifting apart, a slow erosion of love. Sometimes that's true, but often divorce functions less like an accident and more like an exit ramp. A designed one: legal frameworks, social narratives, economic protections, moral justifications. Together, they form a quiet architecture that answers a dangerous question: what happens if I leave? When the answer is relief, support, and validation, behavior changes. Not consciously, strategically. And that's where the word failure does its real damage. Because if you believe you failed, you never examine the structure you were operating inside. When an outcome is framed as failure, the system escapes scrutiny. This is not about blaming women, and it's not about absolving men. It's about understanding incentives instead of worshiping narratives. Because the most dangerous myths are the ones that feel moral, and the myth of divorce as failure keeps men introspective when they should be analytical. It keeps them apologizing when they should be observing. It keeps them rebuilding themselves without ever questioning the terrain they were asked to build on. But before any legal papers were signed, before any words were spoken out loud, something else happened first. The exit didn't begin in court. It began quietly, privately, in the mind. And that's where we're going next. Most people think exits are created in moments of crisis. They're not. They're designed long before anyone feels trapped. Here's the first uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Systems don't respond to emotions. They respond to incentives. Love can be real. Commitment can be sincere. But behavior doesn't run on vows. It runs on architecture. Every serious institution shapes outcomes quietly, through rules, rewards, and consequences. Marriage is no different. When an institution makes leaving possible, behavior subtly shifts. When it makes leaving safe, behavior shifts more. When it makes leaving rewarded, behavior changes entirely. No villain is required. No conspiracy is needed. Only structure. In behavioral economics, there's a concept called optionality. People behave very differently when they know they have an exit, not because they plan to use it, but because knowing they can changes how much they tolerate, invest, and adapt. Think of it like this. A man without an exit fights to repair the house. A person with an exit quietly evaluates whether repairing it is worth the cost. That doesn't make one moral and the other immoral. It makes one embedded and the other mobile. Modern marriage quietly introduced asymmetrical mobility, and mobility is power. On paper, marriage is symmetrical. 2 adults, 2 signatures. 1 agreement. In practice, the exit costs are not experienced the same way. One side often faces immediate identity collapse, social suspicion, financial compression, loss of access, home, children, routine. The other often experiences social validation, moral framing as self-care, institutional support, a ready-made narrative of growth. Again, this is not about morality, it's about friction. Where friction is low, movement increases. Here's what rarely gets discussed. Divorce doesn't begin with paperwork. It begins with comparison. A private question forms, usually unspoken. Would my life be better if I left? Once that question appears, the relationship changes states. Not outwardly, internally. Behavior becomes observational instead of participatory. Moments are logged instead of lived. Conflicts become data points, not problems to solve. This is not malice, it's optimization, and optimization requires an exit to exist. Picture a woman sitting alone late at night, phone glowing softly in the dark. She's not flirting, not cheating, not planning anything dramatic. She's watching other lives, different houses, different partners, different versions of happiness. Her relationship hasn't collapsed. It simply stopped feeling exclusive in her mind. The exit door hasn't opened yet, but it's been located. And once a door is located, the room feels smaller. Meanwhile, the man is still operating under the original rules. Fix it, endure it, be patient, work harder. Because he believes the house has no exit, only repair. He interprets distance as a phase, silence as stress, withdrawal as fatigue. He doesn't realize the relationship is now being evaluated, not inhabited. And evaluations don't require permission. Optionality doesn't create exits. It changes behavior long before exits are used. When divorce finally happens, men experience it as sudden, a rupture, a betrayal of continuity. But structurally, it was a conclusion, not an interruption. The exit door wasn't built during the argument. It was built into the house. The real mistake isn't trusting love, it's ignoring architecture, because love operates inside systems, and systems reward certain moves whether we acknowledge them or not. But the most dangerous phase still isn't legal. It's psychological, because before anyone leaves physically, they leave emotionally. And that departure leaves signals, small, quiet, deniable signals. If you don't know what to look for, you'll miss them. And by the time you notice, the decision is already rehearsed. The most addictive relationships aren't built on love. They're built on uncertainty. There's a principle from behavioral psychology that explains why people stay far longer than they should. Intermittent reinforcement. It's simple and ruthless. When rewards are predictable, the brain relaxes. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain obsesses. This is why slot machines work. This is why notifications hijack attention. And this is why some relationships become psychologically consuming. Warmth appears, then distance, then warmth again. Not enough to feel safe, not enough to leave, just enough to keep you invested. Attachment theory explains how early bonds shape adult behavior. But intermittent reinforcement explains how those bonds are exploited by dynamics, not by villains. When affection becomes conditional, the nervous system shifts into vigilance. You don't feel loved, you feel alert. You start tracking tone, timing, micro changes in behavior, not consciously, but constantly. And the more effort you invest to restore closeness, the more the system trains you to chase it. This isn't romance, it's conditioning. Here's where the shift happens. The partner who controls emotional availability controls the pace of the relationship, not because they planned it, but because availability became scarce. Scarcity creates value. Value creates pursuit. Over time, the roles reverse. The one who once invested equally now withholds slightly. The other compensates excessively. And compensation always feels like commitment, until you realize it's actually leverage. Imagine a man who used to feel chosen. Texts were answered quickly. Affection felt natural. Presence was mutual. Then something changes. Replies slow down. Plans become uncertain. Affection appears, but unpredictably. On good days, it's intense. On bad days, it's absent. He doesn't confront it directly. He adapts. He becomes more accommodating, more patient, more careful. He thinks he's saving the relationship. What he's actually doing is training himself to accept less for the chance of more. Confusion feels like depth to people who value meaning. But psychologically, confusion is a stressor. It activates the same systems as threat. The body releases cortisol. The mind narrows focus. The future becomes the prize. You stop asking, "Is this healthy?" and start asking, "How do I get back to how it was?" That's the trap. Because how it was is often a memory, not a current state. Confusion is not connection, it's a conditioning loop. Men are taught that persistence equals strength. Stay, endure, fix. Don't give up, don't complain. So when emotional access fluctuates, they interpret it as a challenge to overcome, not a signal to evaluate. They double down instead of stepping back. And stepping back is the only move that reveals the truth. Because systems based on intermittent reinforcement collapse under clarity, eventually, conditioning reaches its limit. The chasing partner becomes exhausted. The withholding partner becomes impatient. At that point, uncertainty no longer produces compliance. It produces resistance. And when reinforcement fails, the strategy changes. Affection becomes justification. Distance becomes narrative. The relationship shifts from emotional management to moral preparation. That's when stories begin forming. Internally first. Privately, stories that explain why leaving isn't abandonment, but growth. And once the story is written, it's rehearsed. Next comes the public version. Most relationships don't end with a fight. They end with a story that finally feels convincing enough to tell out loud. Human beings don't move through life guided by facts. We move guided by stories. Stories tell us who we are, what we deserve, and why our actions are justified. Long before divorce becomes a conversation, a private narrative begins to take shape. Not dramatic, not hateful, just explanatory. A quiet internal rewrite that turns uncertainty into meaning. At some point, the relationship stops being a shared experience and becomes a case file. Conversations are no longer lived. They're remembered. Moments aren't felt. They're interpreted. The partner is no longer with you. They are being evaluated. This is the moment the role shifts from participant to plaintiff. Not in court, in the mind. And once that shift happens, everything looks different. Psychology calls this moral licensing. When people believe they've accumulated enough moral justification, they allow themselves actions they previously resisted. The internal dialogue changes tone. I tried. I gave chances. I communicated. I sacrificed. Whether those statements are fully accurate matters less than how true they feel, because once the mind accepts them, leaving stops feeling like betrayal and starts feeling like responsibility to the self. That's the power of narrative. Picture someone journaling late at night, not rage-filled, not dramatic, just reflective. She writes about feeling unseen, about emotional labor, about growing apart. Each sentence isn't just expression, it's rehearsal. The story becomes smoother each time it's told internally. The rough edges soften, contradictions fade, complexity collapses into clarity. By the time the words are spoken out loud, they sound practiced. Because they are, men often experience this phase as calm before the storm. Less conflict, less intensity, more distance, but also less friction. They think things are stabilizing. In reality, the conflict has moved inward, away from dialogue and into decision-making. That's why the announcement feels sudden, not because the decision was rushed, but because the discussion already happened. Without them, there's a telltale sign this phase has begun. Language changes. We becomes I. Us becomes me. Needs replace plans. Feelings replace agreements. Conversations start sounding less like collaboration and more like testimony. Not angry, certain. And certainty is dangerous when it hasn't been shared. When the story feels complete, the decision feels inevitable. Another force is at work here. Identity protection. People don't just want to leave relationships. They want to leave without damaging who they believe themselves to be. The narrative provides that protection. It says, I didn't fail. I evolved. I outgrew it. I chose myself. Again, this isn't manipulation. It's psychology. The mind protects its self-image first. At this stage, logic is irrelevant. Facts bounce off. Promises sound late. Change feels temporary. Because you're no longer debating behavior, you're threatening a finished story. And people defend stories harder than they defend partners. That's why efforts to fix things here often accelerate the exit. They don't challenge the relationship. They challenge the narrative, and narratives fight back. Once the story is internally stable, it seeks witnesses. Friends, family, therapists, anyone who can reflect it back as valid. Validation isn't about advice, it's about confirmation. Because when others nod along, the story hardens. And when the story hardens, the exit becomes a formality. But there's something else happening at the same time. Something more subtle, more practical, more dangerous. While the story is being perfected, the preparation begins. Quietly. Nothing kills desire faster than getting exactly what you wanted. Not because it's bad, but because the brain adapts. There's a psychological law that governs pleasure in modern life: hedonic adaptation. No matter how intense the beginning is, the nervous system always recalibrates. What once felt exciting becomes normal. What once felt special becomes baseline. This happens with money, with status, with cities, and with relationships. Love doesn't disappear, but novelty does. And in a culture that confuses novelty with meaning, stability starts to feel like stagnation. In earlier eras, stability was the goal. Predictability meant safety. Familiarity meant trust. In hyper-modern culture, stability is reframed. It becomes settling. Routine becomes emotional death. Consistency becomes lack of passion, not because those things changed, but because the reference point did. Social media didn't invent dissatisfaction. It industrialized it. Every scroll is a quiet comparison. Someone happier, someone freer, someone more desired, someone living a life that looks lighter. The brain doesn't register these as entertainment. It registers them as alternatives. And alternatives are dangerous to long-term bonds. Because once the mind starts sampling imagined futures, the present relationship stops feeling exclusive. It becomes one option among many. Here's the illusion no one talks about. The mind assumes dissatisfaction means misalignment. And misalignment implies a better match exists, not a different relationship. An upgraded one, more exciting, more affirming, more aligned with the evolved self. But hedonic adaptation doesn't disappear when you change partners. It resets. The cycle restarts. Intensity rises, then normalizes, then disappoints again. Yet, the brain blames the container, not the mechanism. Imagine a woman lying next to a man who hasn't done anything wrong. He's consistent, present, predictable, and that's the problem. There's no tension to interpret as chemistry, no anxiety to confuse with desire, no uncertainty to chase. So the mind creates friction where none exists. Boredom is reinterpreted as incompatibility. Calm is mistaken for emptiness. And the relationship becomes psychologically old, even if nothing is broken. When desire becomes identity, stability feels like suffocation. Men often interpret commitment as completion. Once chosen, they relax, they invest, they stabilize. They don't realize the environment has changed. Modern desire feeds on contrast, not continuity. On novelty, not depth. So when the emotional temperature drops, men search for mistakes, for flaws, for things to fix. But nothing is wrong. The system is simply doing what it's designed to do. At this stage, dissatisfaction stops being emotional and starts becoming strategic. Questions shift from, "Why do I feel this way?" to, "What would my life look like if I left?" Not angrily, not impulsively, rationally. This is where hedonic adaptation hands off to planning. The relationship is no longer the center of the future. It's one variable in a larger equation. And when a relationship becomes a variable, it can be replaced. Stability cannot compete with imagined perfection. It can only compete with reality. And imagined perfection always wins until it's lived. But by then, the decision has already been made. Because once the upgrade illusion takes hold, staying feels like self-betrayal, and leaving feels like growth. That's when the exit stops being emotional. It becomes logistical, quietly, methodically, which leads to the phase almost no one notices until it's over. The preparation phase. The most dangerous moment isn't the announcement. It's the calm that comes before it. By the time preparation begins, the emotional storm is already over. There are no more dramatic swings, no more late-night arguments, no more desperate attempts to be understood. What replaces emotion is clarity, not shared clarity, private clarity. The relationship has been internally reclassified from something to fix to something to exit, and exits require preparation. This phase is often misunderstood. It's not driven by anger, it's driven by risk reduction. Psychology calls this loss aversion, the tendency to minimize downside before making a change. Leaving feels risky, so the mind starts neutralizing uncertainty. Information is gathered, resources are evaluated, support systems are quietly activated, not to hurt anyone, but to ensure the landing is soft. Preparation has a signature. It looks like emotional neutrality replacing warmth, reduced disclosure, increased independence framed as self-growth, a sudden interest in logistics, finances, schedules, boundaries. Conversations become polite, efficient, transactional. There's less conflict because conflict is no longer useful. The decision has moved beyond debate. This is the phase that misleads men the most. The relationship feels lighter, less tension, fewer arguments, more space. He interprets this as improvement. In reality, it's disengagement. Conflict requires investment. Preparation does not. The calm is not peace, it's closure. Picture a couple sitting on the same couch they've shared for years. She's calm, almost kind. He feels uneasy, but can't explain why. She's no longer reactive, no longer defensive, no longer trying to win. She's observing. Not him, but the future. An observation always precedes action. Another tell appears quietly. Old friendships reawaken. New confidants emerge. Not to complain, but to confirm. This isn't about advice. It's about validation. The story built in the previous chapter now needs mirrors. Each nod strengthens resolve. Each "you deserve better" reduces doubt. By the time the announcement happens, it has already been socially rehearsed. When conflict disappears without resolution, preparation has begun. Men often respond to this phase with logic, plans, promises, therapy suggestions. But logic assumes the decision is still open. It isn't. The goal now isn't repair. It's execution with minimal fallout. Every attempt to re-engage emotionally feels like interference, not connection. This is why the announcement feels so cold. No hesitation, no confusion, no visible grief. Because the grief already happened, privately. What you're seeing isn't the beginning. It's the end of a process you weren't invited into. And once preparation is complete, the next step is inevitable. The announcement, clean, final, emotionally efficient. And after that, the system takes over. Lawyers, paperwork, procedures. The part everyone thinks is the story. But it isn't. It's just the last scene. By the time the law gets involved, the story is already over. What follows isn't conflict, it's administration. Most men think divorce begins with lawyers. In reality, lawyers arrive when decisions are no longer emotional. Courtrooms don't decide relationships. They formalize outcomes already chosen. That's why the legal phase feels cold. Procedural, almost surreal. You're not arguing about love, you're negotiating consequences. And if you arrive emotionally late, you arrive strategically weak. Here's a mistake many men make. They treat legal negotiation like a moral conversation. They expect fairness to emerge from reason. They expect compromise to be recognized as virtue. But negotiation psychology doesn't reward virtue. It rewards leverage. Concepts like anchoring, framing, and risk tolerance quietly shape outcomes. The first number spoken matters. The first concession matters more. And the person who is least afraid to walk away usually dictates the terms. Picture a man sitting across from a lawyer, exhausted. He says things like, "I just want this to be over. I don't want to fight. I want what's fair." What he doesn't realize is that fairness has no operating definition in negotiation. Only incentives do. The reasonable man often loses not because he is weak, but because he arrives without a map of the terrain. He's still processing the end emotionally, while the system expects him to operate strategically. There's another psychological trap here: time pressure. When pain is fresh, speed feels merciful. Every extra meeting feels like reopening the wound. Every document feels like salt. So men rush. They sign early. They concede quickly. They prioritize emotional relief over structural positioning. The system doesn't stop them. It simply records the outcome. Remember the preparation phase. One side arrived with a narrative already validated. social support already activated, emotional detachment already completed. The other arrives, confused, reactive, still hoping for repair. This isn't a failure of character, it's a failure of timing. Legal systems don't care who is early or late emotionally. They reward whoever is ready. Kindness without strategy becomes surrender. Many men interpret firm negotiation as hostility. They take it personally. But what they're seeing isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Once a decision has crystallized, hesitation feels like inefficiency. And efficiency looks cold to someone still grieving. Yes, assets matter. Time matters. Access matters. But the deeper loss happens when men leave this phase believing a false story. I lost because I wasn't ruthless enough. I should have been colder. I should never trust again. That conclusion is understandable, but incomplete. Because ruthlessness without awareness is just reaction, and distrust without discernment turns into isolation. The legal finale teaches a brutal but useful lesson. Institutions do not protect emotions. They formalize outcomes. If you bring feelings to a procedural environment, you will feel unseen. Not because you're wrong, but because you're speaking the wrong language. This isn't an argument for cruelty. It's an argument for literacy. Understanding systems doesn't make you bitter. It makes you prepared. After the courtroom, many men swing to extremes. Either total disengagement or total distrust. They confuse awareness with cynicism. But there's another option, one that doesn't require hatred, or paranoia, or emotional shutdown. It requires something rarer, integration. And that's where this journey ends. Not with blame, but with clarity. Awareness doesn't have to harden you. It can sharpen you, without poisoning you. After the dust settles, men tend to split in two directions. Some close off. They turn awareness into armor. They mistake vigilance for wisdom. Others swing the opposite way. They deny what they've learned. They rush back into intimacy, hoping the lesson was a fluke. Both paths miss the point, because the real work isn't withdrawal or denial. It's integration. Understanding incentives doesn't require resentment. You can recognize how structures shape behavior without assuming malicious intent. People don't wake up planning to destroy lives. They respond to environments, narratives, and rewards, often unconsciously. This perspective matters because bitterness keeps you reactive, and reaction is still a form of control. Power begins when you can see clearly and remain steady. There's a difference between trust and blindness. Blind trust assumes alignment. Discernment verifies it. Secure attachment isn't about giving endlessly. It's about choosing carefully. It means vetting values early, discussing incentives openly, clarifying expectations before emotions escalate. Not cynically, soberly. This is not fear. It's respect for yourself and for reality. Picture a man years later, not hardened, not suspicious, calm. He listens more than he performs. He watches patterns instead of promises. He values consistency over intensity. He doesn't rush intimacy to escape loneliness, and he doesn't tolerate ambiguity disguised as depth. When something feels off, he doesn't argue, he observes, because observation reveals truth faster than confrontation ever will. Clarity without resentment is power. This entire journey wasn't about divorce. Divorce was the lens. The real subject was literacy, emotional literacy, psychological literacy, institutional literacy, understanding how narratives form, how incentives operate, how conditioning works, how exits are prepared long before they're used. Once you see these mechanisms, you stop personalizing outcomes that were structurally shaped. You don't excuse them, you contextualize them, and context restores agency. Secure men don't dominate, They don't withdraw. They don't chase. They choose. They build lives that are resilient enough that relationships become additions, not lifelines. They understand that love is real, but it exists inside systems that don't care about romance. So, they design their lives accordingly, with boundaries, with foresight, with calm. This video was never about judging anyone else. It was a mirror. If what you saw disturbed you, that's not a flaw. That's awareness activating, because the real danger was never responding quickly or thinking strategically. The danger was doing so unconsciously. The predator who knows he's a predator has choice. The one who doesn't is just instinct wearing a human face. And the man who understands systems but refuses to become bitter, that man is no longer reactive. He's deliberate. Most people prefer comfortable stories. They protect the ego and preserve hope. You chose clarity, not to isolate yourself, but to navigate the world as it is, not as it's sold. And that choice changes everything. We'll see you in the next analysis of the mind.